I did another really ginormous voting poll situation on my Instagram recently, and I broke it down into two main categories, kind of regular standard flavors and then crazy wacky flavors. And the winner of the more regular flavor vote was tiramisu. Now, if you remember, if you've been following along, I made tiramisu macarons last spring, so I decided to shake it up a little bit, and instead of creating like an accurate tiramisu with the cake, the ladyfinger inside, and the other kind of mascarpone coffee situation around the outside and whatever, I decided to make a ganache. I am also making some standard macaron shells, but I'm adding in a tiny bit of cocoa powder right into the shell instead of dusting it on top. And then I also ground up some coffee beans so I can sprinkle that on to still have the flavor and the sprinkle and everything. I'm really excited to share these macarons with you. So again, French method here for the shell. You can use whatever method you prefer. I just really like the French method for small batches in my kitchen, and I added in my sugar, a little bit of cream of tartar until I got to a really nice stiff peak. Then I'm going to add in the dry ingredients, including that sifted cocoa powder. If you've never worked with cocoa powder in your macarons before, it can be a little bit problematic. So make sure you're going for a cocoa powder, 100% unsweetened cocoa powder. So not hot cocoa mix, nothing like that. And then it's also really important to add in a small amount. A little bit goes a long way. And make sure to sift it in there. Even if you don't sift or food process your other dry ingredients, the almond flour and powdered sugar, cocoa powder clumps up really easily, and you want to make sure that it is distributed throughout your macaron shells and that it doesn't leave any weird hard lumps in there. Otherwise, this process, the macaronage, is going to go exactly like normal. I'm just adding the dry ingredients into my meringue in about 3 additions, mixing each time to incorporate them before adding in any more. Then once everything is incorporated in here, I'm going to press and fold my macaron batter against the sides of my bowl. And I'm going to continue those motions until I reach the ribbon stage, which is when I pull my spatula up out of the batter. It should fall back down into the bowl really nicely like a ribbon. Then it's going to be time to pipe. So meanwhile, I've got my piping bag fitted with my piping tip at the ready. I really like to use large piping bags that can fit all of my macaron batter, and I really prefer the Ateco 803 or 804 piping tips that you can use whatever feels the most comfortable to you. I'll also be using a Silpat here and then a little template I just printed off the internet underneath there to make sure my macarons all end up the same size. I've got those coffee grounds from earlier and then my cocoa powder macaron batter. First, I'm going to pipe all of my circles just like normal. There is nothing special or different about how I'm piping these shells. I'm just making sure that my piping bag and piping tip are perpendicular to where my counter and Silpat are, and then I'm using a twisting motion with my wrist and arm to try to cut off the batter so I'm not leaving any big lumps or bumps that I'll need to work on smoothing out later. Then after all of these shells are piped, I'm going to slide this silpat onto a baking pan so I can tap the bottom and remove any large air bubbles while smoothing out any little lumps that remain on the surface. It's really important for this because I do want to sprinkle on the coffee grounds that I do tap the bottom of the trays first before sprinkling that on, unless you are like super duper careful to only sprinkle on top of exactly the macaron shells. If you sprinkle the coffee grounds and then you go to tap your trays, that tapping motion is going to fling any excess grounds all over your counter, probably all over the floor, all over you. So highly recommend piping, tapping your tray, then doing any sprinkling of anything, whether it's coffee or actual sprinkles. If you are not a huge coffee lover, you can leave these out. I really love using things like this, ingredients as a decoration. I think it worked out so well, and I love that these macs have the flavor and texture of the cocoa and coffee in the shell as well as in the ganache itself, giving this a really well-rounded tiramisu vibe. Then I'm going to let these macaron shells just rest on my counter. I usually like to do this for about 20 minutes in my home kitchen, though it might be shorter or longer for you, depending on so many variables like where you live, what the weather's like, etc. I also really love baking just one tray at a time at 300 degrees Fahrenheit for about 16 to 18 minutes in my home kitchen. That might be longer or shorter for you. You might be able to bake 2 trays at once. It really depends. So do what feels best for you in your kitchen. Now onto the most important part, the ganache. So I wanted to keep this as true to a tiramisu as possible. So I've got white chocolate as well as a little bit of dark chocolate. I've got some espresso. You could use a coffee liqueur, coffee extract, or regular coffee. I have some mascarpone cheese. I have unsalted butter. I have vanilla. I have cream. I have sugar. And then I also have some marsala wine. I am adding that with the espresso and the cream and the sugar into a small saucepan along with the vanilla. Then I have the second amount of cream in with the cornstarch. I've got all the other ingredients set aside. This is a pastry cream style ganache, so I do have that small saucepan with the cream, the marsala wine, the sugar, the vanilla, and the espresso on the stove, and I'm going to heat that up before tempering it into the cornstarch and second cream. Cornstarch can get a little bit clumpy if it's not tempered in, which is why I'm doing it this way. And the cornstarch is really necessary because, as I mentioned, this is a pastry cream style ganache. So it is super important to have some sort of agent that can help thicken up the ganache and get it to where we need it to be before it's used to fill the macarons. If you leave out the cornstarch, this ganache will not thicken up properly and things will go awry. If you have never made a pastry cream style ganache before, make sure not to overcook it. So as soon as everything's incorporated here, really pay attention to that. And then later on, be also very careful about not adding the butter before it is time. Those two things can often lead to a failed ganache recipe. So if this is new to you, if ganache is new to you, please be a little bit careful as you're making this for the first time. The reason I love this style of ganache and the reason I really love using it for something like a tiramisu macaron is because it is so creamy and the ratio of white chocolate is quite small, so it ends up being a really subtle flavor. And because tiramisu has a little bit of chocolate on the very top of it with that cocoa powder, otherwise, it is not a chocolate-based dessert, so I really wanted a ganache that had just a subtle hint of chocolate in it, but the dominant flavors were going to be coming from the espresso, the marsala wine, from the mascarpone, that extra creaminess. So this was really the perfect kind of ganache for me in this moment. However, if this kind of ganache is not your vibe or if it feels too complicated, you absolutely can use these same ideas about adapting a ganache for a more standard ganache recipe. After you've tempered in the cornstarch and cream, make sure to whisk continuously over a low or medium-low heat. You want to be sure not to overheat and not to overcook this pastry cream mixture, so that is super duper important. The other thing that I am doing while this is happening, I've got the chocolates, both the dark and white chocolate, in my microwave melting just a little bit. 30 to 45 seconds is honestly perfect for me. It's not absolutely necessary, but when ingredients are closer to the same temperature, it actually really helps everything incorporate easier and more smoothly. As you can see here, this is really starting to thicken up nicely. I'm just going to cook it a second longer to get even more of that liquid evaporated, really let that cornstarch work. Then I'm going to pull it off the heat, make sure not to overcook this, and then I'm going to pour it over my chocolates. Usually with this style ganache, I use white chocolate, but because I wanted to give more of that hint of the cocoa powder layer that is usually coating a tiramisu, I wanted to add in just a little bit of a dark chocolate to make sure I had that punch of flavor, but I didn't want it to be overwhelming, which is why I balance it out with white chocolate. After pouring that thickened pastry cream style mixture over the chocolates, I'm going to give it a really good stir to make sure everything is completely incorporated before setting it aside to just sit at room temperature for 15 to 20 minutes. I want to make sure that this really has reached a warm but not hot temperature. I don't want it to be cold, so don't stick it in your refrigerator, but let it cool down a bit so when you go to emulsify in the butter and mascarpone cheese, that it is not going to melt or get really weird or separated. The other really important thing to do here is to use an immersion blender to emulsify in all the ingredients. This is going to lead to the best texture in your ganache. I know it looks really chocolatey right now. The hint of the dark chocolate combined with the espresso and the Marsala wine are really giving it a deep brown color right now. That's going to lighten up in just a minute with the addition of the butter and the mascarpone. Okay, now that I have got this smoothed out and emulsified, I'm going to start adding in the butter a little bit at a time, followed by the mascarpone cheese. Make sure that those two things are at room temperature so they are relatively soft and will be easy to incorporate into the ganache. And for your butter, make sure that it is unsalted butter. You do not ever want to be using salted butter in your pastry kitchen. Emulsified in all of the butter first, followed by the mascarpone. I don't think you necessarily have to do it that way, but I was just starting off making it more like a standard ganache and then adding in that last flavor at the end. I don't think it would do any harm to add the mascarpone in first, but I would recommend to be a little bit careful about not dumping in everything and overwhelming the ganache right away. And also, if you take too long to add everything in, you might end up kind of whipping your ganache, and it might also get a little bit weird. So be sure that you are working swiftly, not too fast, but also not too slow. Kind of want a Goldilocks situation for this ganache. After letting this cool completely, I stuck it into my refrigerator just to make sure it got really nice and thick, and because of that mascarpone cheese in there, I did not want this to be sitting out at room temperature for too long. So after about an hour of it chilling to room temperature, I stuck it into my fridge just for another hour or so before piping it. I am obsessed with this ganache. Seriously, everyone, it was so good. You have so many flavors, so many layers. of things going on in here. And then with the texture difference with the macaron shell acting kind of like the ladyfinger, the ganache acting more like the cream in a tiramisu. You have the cocoa and the little bit of dark chocolate. You have the mascarpone, you have the espresso, you have the Marsala wine, you have the coffee grounds on the shell. Oh my gosh. Seriously, it's just so delicious, and I really hope you give this a try. I absolutely was just wowed by the results. After getting all of these sandwiched, I am getting them into my refrigerator for at least 24 hours to fully mature before eating them. If you're not enjoying these within the first week of making them, I would definitely get them into your freezer, especially with the addition of the mascarpone cheese. I think that's super important to do to keep it fresh for the longest possible amount of time. And if you're not eating them in that first week, get them into your freezer as soon as you make them, and then they will not get weird or soggy if you have them in your fridge first and then freezer and then fridge again. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Thank you to everyone who voted over on Instagram for this flavor. Ended up being really fun to make a second version of this as a macaron. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you guys do too. Make sure to subscribe down below if you haven't already. I'd love to see you here again next time. Until then, I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.